Good evening, and welcome to Lamplight and Historian. I'm Charles. Tonight, we're following one of Europe's longest political stories, the Holy Roman Empire. It lasted for centuries, changed shape repeatedly, and resisted almost every simple definition people have tried to give it. Look at a map of the empire at almost any point in its history, and the first thing you notice is not unity. You see kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, counties, and cities. Some were large, some were tiny, some were ruled by secular princes, others by bishops or abbots. Their rights overlapped. Their loyalties overlapped. Their laws could overlap too. And above them stood an emperor who was powerful, but rarely powerful, in the way a modern ruler might expect to be. He did not simply inherit a centralized state and command it from a capital. His crown was elective. Princes guarded their privileges. Bishops governed territories. Cities defended charters. Popes might support him, oppose him, or do both at different moments. So the obvious question is not why the empire was divided. Division is visible almost everywhere in its history. The harder question is why that division did not destroy it much earlier. To get at that, we have to go back to a time before the empire carried its familiar name, when Western Europe was still living among the political remains of Rome. In the 8th century, the great power in much of Western Europe was the Frankish kingdom, ruled by the Carolingian dynasty. Charlemagne inherited part of that realm in 768 and soon became its sole king. Over the next decades, his power expanded through war, diplomacy, dynastic politics, and Christian mission. His armies entered Lombard Italy and moved across large parts of Central Europe. The long wars against the Saxons were especially harsh. They were not simply campaigns of territorial expansion. They also involved forced political submission and religious conversion. Later, generations often wrapped Charlemagne in the language of imperial greatness. But that should not hide how coercive the process could be. At the same time, Charlemagne built a close relationship with the Roman Church. That alliance solved problems for both sides. The papacy needed military protection in Italy. The Frankish monarchy gained something armies alone could not provide: a stronger connection to the religious authority of Rome. Then came the moment that would echo through the next 1,000 years. On Christmas Day, in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor in Rome. It is tempting to treat that scene as the birth of the Holy Roman Empire. But that is too neat. The later empire did not appear fully formed in a single ceremony. What the coronation did create was a precedent. A powerful ruler in Western Europe could claim Roman imperial dignity, and the Bishop of Rome could play a central role in recognizing it. The crown came with a problem built into it. The Roman Empire had not vanished from memory. Roman law, Latin, Christian institutions, old cities, roads, and political ideas remained part of European life. More importantly, the Eastern Roman Empire was still very much alive in Constantinople. It had its own emperor and its own claim to Roman continuity. So if there was already a Roman emperor in the East, what exactly had Leo III created in the West? No answer satisfied everyone. That uncertainty never completely disappeared. In fact, it became part of the imperial inheritance. Now move away from the ceremony in Rome and think about how Charlemagne actually governed. There was no permanent capital in the modern sense, although Aachen became his favoured residence. Government moved with the ruler. Assemblies mattered. Counts mattered. Bishops and abbots mattered. Messengers mattered. So did the simple ability of the king or emperor to travel through his lands and be physically present. Picture a written order leaving the royal court. On parchment, the command could sound absolute. But once it travelled beyond the ruler's immediate reach, someone local still had to enforce it. A count, a bishop, an abbot, a noble family with men and land of its own. That gap between command and enforcement is one of the keys to medieval politics. Roads were slow. Communication was irregular. Local elites controlled fortifications, manpower, information, and property. A ruler could claim enormous authority and still possess very little of what we would now call administrative infrastructure. Charlemagne's solution was not to eliminate local power. It was to build local power into imperial government. The church was especially useful in that system. Bishops and abbots often had the education, records, estates, and networks needed to administer territory. The Carolingian court encouraged schools, manuscript copying, the correction of religious texts, and a more standardized written Latin. Later historians called this the Carolingian Renaissance. The label can make the change sound more sudden than it was. Learning remained concentrated in relatively small circles. Still, the copying carried out in monasteries and schools preserved works that might otherwise have disappeared. Government, religious reform, and scholarship became tied together. For a while, that combination looked remarkably strong. But look closely and a structural weakness appears. The system depended heavily on the ruler who held it together. When Charlemagne died in 814, his son Louis the Pious inherited the imperial title. Louis then faced a problem, common to dynastic monarchies. How do you keep a large realm united, while also giving royal sons meaningful inheritances? There was no easy answer. Family conflict widened into civil war. Sons rebelled against their father and against one another. Nobles and churchmen took sides. Regional interests attached themselves to dynastic claims. After Louis died in 840, the struggle continued until his surviving sons reached the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The Carolingian realm was divided. Charles, the Bald, received the western portion. Louis the German took the eastern kingdom. Lothair kept the imperial title and ruled a long middle zone stretching from the North Sea toward Italy. None of those territories matches a modern country, but the division pushed different political centres onto different paths. The Western Kingdom became increasingly associated with the future France. The Eastern Kingdom became the main foundation from which the medieval German kingdom would emerge. Between them lay borderlands, whose loyalties remained contested for generations. The imperial title survived. Carolingian unity did not. By the late 9th century, royal authority in East Francia had weakened further. Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Lotharingia were not just administrative labels. They had powerful aristocracies, regional traditions, and leaders who could not be treated as simple royal employees. External pressure made the weakness easier to see. Viking raiders moved along the rivers and coasts of Western Europe. Magyar horsemen struck into Central and Western Europe, along the eastern frontier. Slavic peoples and emerging powers complicated the political landscape. At that point, restoring Charlemagne's enormous realm was no longer a realistic goal. The real problem had changed. Could anyone build a durable political order out of the eastern fragments without pretending those fragments no longer had power of their own? In the early 10th century, the answer began to take shape in Saxony. In 919, Henry, Duke of Saxony, was chosen as King of East Francia. He is remembered as Henry the Fowler, although some stories attached to that name sit closer to legend than firm evidence. The important point is simpler. Henry became king in a realm where kingship depended on negotiation with men who already controlled major regions. He could not rule Germany as if it were one large royal estate. Bavaria could resist him. Swabia had its own leading families. Franconia remained politically important. Lotharingia sat between eastern and western Frankish worlds. Each region had military resources, aristocratic networks, and traditions that a king had to work with rather than simply sweep aside. Henry's monarchy was therefore practical before it was grand. He pushed when he could. He recognized local power when he had to. His aim was not to erase the dukes, but to establish himself as the leading ruler among them. Then an external danger gave that kingship a sharper purpose. Magyar raiders had shown how vulnerable the German lands could be. Mounted forces could cross a region quickly, strike settlements, and withdraw before slower armies concentrated against them. The problem was not courage. It was organization, speed, and preparation. Henry bought time through a truce and used that time to strengthen defenses. Fortified places became more important. Local military organization improved. Mounted forces received greater attention. In 933, Henry's army defeated a Magyar force at Ried. The victory did not end the Magyar threat. That came later. But it did something politically valuable. It showed that coordination under a king could work. When Henry died in 936, his son Otto succeeded him. This is where the story changes scale. Otto I would not simply defend the Eastern Kingdom. He would reconnect German kingship with the old Roman imperial idea. But first, he had to survive his own political system. Royal succession was never automatic, in the way later hereditary monarchies sometimes tried to present it. Dukes, counts, bishops, and members of the royal family all had interests. Otto faced repeated rebellions, including resistance from relatives. Those struggles taught him a hard lesson. A king who depended entirely on hereditary dukes could end up strengthening families powerful enough to challenge the crown itself. Otto increasingly leaned on bishops and abbots. This arrangement is sometimes described as an imperial church system. The phrase can sound more tidy than the reality, but the logic is easy to see. A great bishop was not only a churchman. He could administer estates, advise the king, help move resources, provide military support, and govern strategically important territory. And there was another advantage from the ruler's point of view. A duke could pass power to a son and turn office into a lasting dynasty. A bishop, at least in principle, did not leave a legitimate hereditary heir to his church office. If the king could influence episcopal appointments, he could place trusted men in powerful positions without automatically creating another permanent princely family, for a time, that helped the crown. It also planted a problem that would explode a century later. If bishops were spiritual leaders, why should kings have so much influence over who became bishop in the first place? That question can wait for the moment. Otto had more immediate dangers. In 955, the Magyars returned in force. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Lechfeld near Augsburg, where Otto's army won a decisive victory. Lechfeld mattered because it changed more than one military season. Major Magyar raiding into the German lands declined sharply afterward. Over the following generations, the political world of the Hungarian plain also changed, and the Kingdom of Hungary became part of Latin Christian Europe. For Otto, the victory created prestige. He was no longer merely a king managing rebellious dukes. He could present himself as a defender of the Christian realm. That opened the door to Italy. Italy had a strange pull on German rulers. On the map, the Alps separated the German kingdom from the peninsula. In political imagination, Rome connected them. A ruler who wanted Roman imperial dignity could hardly ignore the city from which that dignity took its name. But Italy was not an empty stage waiting for German kings. Northern and central Italy contained wealthy cities, major bishops, old aristocratic families, and intense local rivalries. Every expedition south promised prestige and consumed resources at the same time. That trade-off would return again and again. The farther an emperor looked toward Rome, the more carefully he had to watch Germany behind him. Otto intervened in Italy in the early 950s. By 961, he returned with the imperial crown clearly within reach. On the 2nd of February, 962, Pope John XXX crowned Otto emperor in Rome. This coronation is often treated as the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. That is useful shorthand, but it can mislead if taken too literally. Otto did not stand in St. Peter's using the exact political name later generations would recognize. The terminology developed gradually. The word holy became attached to the empire in the 12th century. The phrase, connecting it specifically to the German nation, came later still. The institution existed before its final name settled. What Otto restored was a Roman imperial title held by a German king who also claimed authority in Italy. That combination became one of the empire's basic structures. A king was chosen north of the Alps. He ruled through powerful regional interests. He went into Italy when circumstances allowed. He sought imperial dignity and claimed responsibilities larger than those of an ordinary king. The tension is already visible. The emperor could see himself as protector of Western Christendom. German princes could see him as a ruler whose authority had limits. A pope could welcome imperial protection while resisting imperial interference. An Italian city might support the emperor against a local enemy, then resist him when imperial demands threatened its own autonomy. Everyone could belong to the same political order and still disagree about what that order meant. Otto died in 973. His son Otto II inherited both the crown and those contradictions. He pursued power in Italy, suffered a serious defeat in southern Italy in 982, and died the next year. His son, Otto III, was still young. Otto III developed one of the boldest imperial visions of the Middle Ages. His court reflected both Latin, Western, and Byzantine influences, and he placed unusual emphasis on Rome itself. He imagined the ancient city as the center of a renewed Christian imperial order. For a brief moment, his relationship with Pope Sylvester II suggested that emperor and pope might cooperate in a broader vision of Christian government. But the machinery did not exist to make that vision durable. Rome was politically unstable. German princes had priorities far from Italy. An emperor could imagine universal rule more easily than he could administer it. Otto III died in 1002, still a young man. Henry II followed him and was crowned emperor in 1014. His reign returned to the practical work that had shaped the dynasty from the beginning, managing nobles, church institutions, Italian affairs, regional revolts, and the limits of royal administration. Then Henry died without an heir in 1024. The Ottonian dynasty was finished, but the office was not. That difference is easy to miss. Charlemagne's political unity had broken apart badly after dynastic crisis. Now, the imperial system was beginning to show another kind of resilience. A ruling family could disappear without taking the crown with it. The next question was obvious, even if nobody could answer it yet. If the emperor was not simply the owner of the empire, then who controlled the office when dynasties changed? After Henry II died, the princes chose Conrad II as king in 1024. Conrad belonged to the Salian dynasty, a family with roots in the Rhineland. His election made something increasingly clear. Inheritance mattered, sometimes enormously, but the German crown was not simply private property passed automatically from father to son. Election mattered too. That combination would define imperial politics for centuries. Conrad was crowned emperor in Rome in 1027. He strengthened royal authority, brought the Kingdom of Burgundy into the imperial political sphere, and maintained the crown's influence over bishops and leading aristocrats. His son Henry III inherited an unusually strong monarchy in 1039. Under Henry III, imperial influence over the church reached one of its high points. The papacy was troubled by factional conflict, and Henry intervened directly in Roman church affairs. At the Synod of Sutri in 1046, rival papal claims were addressed, and Henry helped bring about a succession of reform-minded German popes. From Henry's perspective, intervention could look like reform. A powerful emperor was helping restore order to a troubled papacy. But this is where the evidence begins to turn against the assumptions that made the system work. Church reformers increasingly attacked simony, the buying and selling of church office. They pushed for stronger clerical discipline. And then they focused on a practice that reached straight into the foundations of imperial government, lay rulers investing bishops with the symbols of office. To understand why that became explosive, narrow the story down to one bishop. A bishop in the 11th century empire was not only a spiritual teacher, he might control land, collect revenues, preside over courts, command fortifications, and owe military or political service. For a king, such a man could be a central part of government. So if the emperor lost influence over who became bishop, he risked losing influence over major pieces of the political system. But from the reformers' side, the same arrangement looked deeply compromised. If a secular ruler could effectively choose a bishop, how independent was the church? And if spiritual office came from God, why should a king be the one handing over its symbols? The dispute is often described as church against state. That is too modern. Both sides assumed that religious and political order belonged together. They fought over the hierarchy inside that shared Christian world. Henry III died in 1056. His son Henry IV was still a child. Minority rule weakened the monarchy at exactly the wrong moment. Great nobles recovered room to maneuver. Local disputes widened. Reformers in Rome became more confident. In 1059, new rules for papal elections strengthened the cardinals and reduced the legitimacy of direct secular influence. The balance was shifting before Henry IV was old enough to control it. By the time he ruled for himself, he faced serious opposition in Saxony and a papacy with much larger claims for its own authority. In 1073, the reforming monk Hildebrand became Pope Gregory VII. The immediate fight centered on bishops. The deeper fight was about judgment itself. Could a pope judge a king? Could a king dismiss a pope? And if a king was excommunicated, were his subjects still bound by their oaths to him? Those questions sound theoretical, until we remember what excommunication meant in a society where political obedience and spiritual belonging were tightly connected. In early 1076, Henry and bishops loyal to him met at Worms and rejected Gregory's authority. Gregory answered with excommunication. The religious penalty quickly became a political weapon. German princes who already opposed Henry now had a new argument. If the king stood outside the communion of the church, why should their loyalty to him remain untouched? Henry's position weakened sharply. So he crossed the Alps in the winter of 1076 and 1077 and sought Gregory at Canossa, where the Pope was staying under the protection of Matilda of Tuscany. Canossa became one of the most famous images in medieval history. Later, retellings added dramatic details, and not all of them are equally secure. The political fact is clear enough. Henry performed penance, and Gregory lifted the excommunication. If we stop there, it looks like a complete papal triumph. But the story did not stop there. Henry returned to the struggle. German princes chose Rudolf of Rheinfelden as a rival king. Civil war followed. Gregory excommunicated Henry again. Henry backed an opposing pope, Clement III. In 1084, Henry entered Rome and was crowned emperor by Clement. Gregory left the city and died in exile the following year. So who won? Not the pope in any final sense, not the emperor either. What changed was the structure around them. The old assumption that German kings could exercise broad control over the imperial church had been badly damaged. At the same time, the papacy had shown that it could challenge an emperor, but not simply take over German politics. The struggle continued under Henry IV. Finally, in 1122, emperor and papacy reached the Concordat of Worms. The agreement drew a clearer distinction between the spiritual appointment of bishops and the secular rights and possessions tied to their offices. It did not solve every dispute. It was a compromise, but compromises can change systems more deeply than victories. The monarchy could no longer rely as comfortably on the old fusion of royal and episcopal authority, and the princes had learned something during the decades of conflict when kings needed recognition, money, soldiers or votes. Princely cooperation had value. That cooperation could be exchanged for privileges. Here is one of the empire's recurring paradoxes. A weaker centre did not always mean a weaker political order. Sometimes royal weakness redistributed power into other institutions and made those institutions more invested in the empire's survival. After Henry V died childless, in 1125, the princes elected Lothair of Supplinburg rather than simply accepting the strongest dynastic claim. When Lothair died in 1137, competition returned, especially between the Hohenstaufen and Welf families. By now, the empire was becoming a system in which no ruler could permanently eliminate every rival power. That produced instability, certainly, but it also meant that a single dynastic collapse did not have to destroy the whole structure. No family completely owned the imperial crown. The office stood above the dynasties competing to wear it. Then, in 1152, the princes chose Frederick of Hohenstaufen He intended to make that office feel powerful again. Frederick I became king of the Germans in 1152. Later generations called him Barbarossa, the Red Beard. But his importance has little to do with appearance, and much more to do with a political problem he inherited. After decades of civil conflict, what did imperial authority still mean in practice? Frederick cared intensely about what medieval political language called the honour or dignity of the empire. That can sound ceremonial to modern ears. It was not. Rights, precedents, titles, legal claims, and public rituals could all translate into money, obedience, and political leverage. If an emperor allowed a right to lapse, later rulers might discover that recovering it was far harder than losing it. Frederick therefore wanted more than prestige. He wanted old imperial claims to have practical weight again. The map made that difficult. North of the Alps, German princes remained strong. In northern Italy, wealthy communes had become confident and increasingly self-governing. Milan dominated much of Lombardy and alarmed neighbouring cities. The papacy wanted protection, but also independence. Farther south, the Norman kingdom of Sicily had become a major political power. Frederick did not face one opposition. He faced several political worlds, with different reasons to resist him. He crossed the Alps early in his reign and received the imperial crown from Pope Adrian IV in 1155. The partnership did not stay comfortable for long. At Byzantium, in 1157, a papal letter used a Latin word that could mean a benefit, but could also carry the sense of a fief. Imperial princes reacted furiously to the possibility that the empire itself might somehow be described as something held from the Pope. One word had touched the deepest unresolved question in the system. Who stood above whom? Was the emperor the protector of the church? Or did papal coronation imply that imperial dignity depended on papal authority? No agreed constitution answered that question. At roughly the same time, imperial language became more explicitly sacred. The phrase, Holy Empire, began to appear. The title was not merely decorative. It expressed a claim that the empire belonged to a universal Christian order, not just to one German dynasty. Frederick now turned to northern Italy, where law and power met directly. At the Diet of Roncaglia in 1158, legal scholars helped define imperial claims to tolls, markets, roads, judicial rights, and other regalian powers. Think of it less as an emperor trying to invent a modern central government and more as a ruler opening an old ledger and saying, "These rights belong to the crown, and I want them back." For the Italian communes, that was threatening enough. Cities such as Milan had developed courts, alliances, militias, and economic networks of their own. Local elites had become accustomed to governing without constant imperial supervision. What Frederick called restoration, they could experience as subordination. War followed. Milan surrendered in 1162, and its fortifications were dismantled. That looked like a major imperial victory. It also taught the other communes the wrong lesson from Frederick's point of view. If each city faced the emperor alone, each could be forced to submit, so they stopped facing him alone. In 1167, northern Italian cities formed what became known as the Lombard League. Pope Alexander III also opposed Frederick, who supported rival papal claimants. The conflict now linked three issues that were difficult to separate: urban independence, papal authority, and imperial restoration. Frederick returned to Italy repeatedly. Each expedition demanded troops, money, food, and political cooperation from German princes. And each time the emperor spent months or years south of the Alps. Opportunities opened for manoeuvring in Germany. Prestige was not the same thing as resources. The military turning point came in 1176 near Legnano, where the Lombard League defeated Frederick's army. The defeat did not destroy the empire. It destroyed the idea that northern Italy could be settled by force alone. So the method changed. In 1177, Frederick recognized Alexander III in the Peace of Venice. In 1183, the Peace of Constance created a longer, lasting arrangement with the Lombard communes. The cities kept extensive rights of self-government, while formally recognizing imperial authority. Was that an imperial failure? If the goal was direct control, yes, in part. But that is not the only way to read it. The settlement also revealed something that would become typical of the Holy Roman Empire. The center pushed. Local powers resisted. Neither side could eliminate the other. The result was a negotiated layer of rights that allowed both to remain inside the same political framework. Frederick found a similar problem north of the Alps. Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, had once been one of the emperor's most powerful allies. Their relationship deteriorated, especially when Henry did not provide the support Frederick expected for an Italian campaign. Eventually, Henry was tried before a princely court, stripped of his duchies, and driven into exile. That sounds like a victory for central monarchy. But look at what happened to the land. Henry's great territorial position was broken up, rather than absorbed into one compact royal domain. Other princes gained from his fall. The emperor defeated a rival and, in the same process, reinforced the political fragmentation of the empire. That was not an accident of one reign. It was a recurring structural problem. Emperors often needed to reward allies with the very resources that might otherwise have strengthened the crown. Frederick's dynastic policy created another opening, this time in southern Italy. His son Henry married Constance of Sicily, heiress to the Norman kingdom. On a map, the implications were obvious. Hohenstaufen Germany lay to the north. Imperial interests reached through Italy. Sicily lay to the south. For the papacy, a single dynasty surrounding the papal states from both directions was alarming. For Frederick, it looked like opportunity. Then Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, and the political focus shifted again. Frederick joined the Third Crusade. Now an aging emperor with decades of experience behind him, he led a large army overland through the Balkans and Anatolia. In 1190, while crossing a river in Cilicia, Frederick died. His death threw the crusading army into confusion. Many participants turned back. Others continued in reduced numbers. Later German legend transformed Barbarossa into a sleeping emperor who would return in a moment of national need. The historical Frederick left a more complicated record. He had not permanently subdued the Lombard cities. He had not settled the great argument between emperor and pope. He had not turned Germany into a centralized hereditary monarchy, but he had restored much of the crown's prestige, and perhaps more importantly, shown that imperial authority could survive defeat by changing form. His son, Henry V, would push Hohenstaufen power farther, and Henry's son would inherit a political puzzle even more difficult than Barbarossa's Germany in the north, Italy in the centre, Sicily in the south, papal suspicion in between, and a Roman imperial title that still claimed more than any ruler could comfortably control. His name was Frederick II. When Henry vacated the kingdom of Sicily through his marriage to Constance, the Hohenstaufen position briefly looked extraordinary. Germany lay to the north. The imperial kingdom of Italy occupied the middle. Sicily and southern Italy lay below Rome. If one dynasty could hold all three securely, the papal territories would sit between Hohenstaufen spheres of power. On parchment, it looked almost like a completed design. Then Henry VI died in 1197. His son Frederick was still a child, and the German succession immediately fractured. Rival kings were chosen. Otto I of the Welf family and Philip of Swabia from the Hohenstaufen side competed for power. Popes, German princes, the kings of France, and the kings of England all found reasons to involve themselves. That tells us something important about the empire by this point. There was no isolated German succession crisis. A disputed crown in Germany affected Italy. Italian politics affected the Pope. Papal policy affected the German election. French and English rivalry could enter the same contest. The empire was not a sealed political world. It sat in the middle of Europe's wider balance of power. Eventually Frederick, the child who had inherited Sicily, emerged as the strongest Hohenstaufen claimant. He became German king and was crowned emperor in 1220. Frederick II had grown up in Sicily, and that mattered. His political environment was very different from that of a Saxon or Bavarian prince. The Kingdom of Sicily had a comparatively developed royal administration. Its population included Latin Christians, Greek Christians, Jews, and Muslims. That diversity produced cultural exchange, but it should not be romanticized. Frederick's reign also included coercion, forced movement, and religious conflict. His court became famous for intellectual curiosity. Frederick corresponded with scholars, took an interest in natural philosophy, wrote about falconry, and ruled through an administration more elaborate than anything available to him in Germany. Later writers sometimes portrayed him as a man almost outside the Middle Ages. The evidence does not require that conclusion. Frederick was deeply medieval in his assumptions about kingship, religion, hierarchy, and power. What made him unusual was the range of worlds he moved between, and that range created his central problem. How could one ruler govern Sicily closely, maintain authority in Germany, control northern Italy, fulfill crusading obligations, and avoid a permanent war with the papacy? He could not do all of those things at the same time without making concessions somewhere. Germany was one of those places. After securing his position, Frederick spent relatively little time north of the Alps. He relied heavily on German princes and granted important concessions that strengthened their territorial jurisdictions. That was not simply neglect. It was a political trade. Frederick needed cooperation in Germany, while he concentrated on Italy and Sicily. But trades have long-term costs. As princes gained stronger legal, fiscal, and political authority in their own territories, the German kingdom moved farther away from the kind of centralized monarchy developing in France or England. Frederick could be a strong king in Sicily and a more negotiated king in Germany at the same time. The papacy saw the other side of that strength, a Hohenstaufen ruler controlling Sicily and claiming authority in northern Italy threatened to surround the papal states. The Pope therefore had reasons to worry about Frederick even before theology entered the argument. Then came the crusading dispute. Frederick had promised to go to the Holy Land, but delayed repeatedly. Pope Gregory excommunicated him. In 1228, Frederick sailed on crusade while still excommunicated. That alone made the expedition unusual. What happened next made it stranger still. Rather than recovering Jerusalem through a major battlefield victory, Frederick negotiated with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil. The agreement restored Christian control over Jerusalem and several other places for a limited period, while Muslim control of key sacred spaces was respected. In 1229, Frederick crowned himself in Jerusalem. Pause over that image for a moment. A Christian emperor who had been excommunicated by the Pope had regained access to Jerusalem through diplomacy with a Muslim ruler. For admirers, it looked like intelligence succeeding where armies had failed. For Frederick's enemies, it solved very little. The papacy did not treat the achievement as proof that the larger conflict should end, and northern Italy remained unsettled. Like his grandfather Barbarossa, Frederick wanted stronger imperial authority over the Lombard communes. Like Barbarossa, he found that the cities were not simply administrative units waiting to obey. He defeated the Lombard League at Cortenuova in 1237. For a moment, the imperial position looked dominant, but the same old problem returned. A military victory could defeat an army. It could not erase the political structure that produced the resistance. Cities still had interests. Popes still had interests. German princes still had interests. The emperor's own family had interests too. His son Henry, already made king in Germany, rebelled. Frederick suppressed the revolt and imprisoned him. Papal opposition intensified. Gregory excommunicated Frederick again in 1239. Gregory's successor Innocent IV became an even more determined enemy. At the Council of Lyon in 1245, Innocent declared Frederick deposed, although whether a pope could actually remove an emperor in political practice remained deeply contested. Germany again experienced rival kingship. Italy remained at war. By this point, the conflict had become too tangled for a simple label. It was not merely emperor against pope. It was not Germany against Italy. It was not monarchy against cities. Italian factions had local rivalries. German princes calculated territorial advantage. Papal policy mixed spiritual claims with concern for the political independence of central Italy. Dynasty, law, religion, and geography had fused into one prolonged struggle. In 1248, Frederick's forces suffered a major setback at Parma. 2 years later, in 1250, Frederick died in southern Italy. With him ended the most ambitious Hohenstaufen attempt to make the imperial crown genuinely Mediterranean in its political reach. The dynasty then collapsed with startling speed. Frederick's son Conrad IV died in 1254. Another son, Manfred, later ruled Sicily, but was defeated and killed in 1266 by Charles of Anjou, who had entered southern Italy with papal support. In 1268, Frederick's grandson Conradin tried to recover the family inheritance. He was captured and executed in Naples. The Hohenstaufen project was finished. At first glance, this looks like the kind of dynastic destruction that should have pulled the empire down with it. But streets still opened to market traffic. Bishops still held courts. Princes still governed. Cities still collected tolls and defended privileges. Local law did not stop because no emperor could dominate Germany. That is the next major shift in the story. The empire had become weak at the centre, but increasingly durable below the centre. The middle decades of the 13th century are often called the Great Interregnum. The name encourages a simple picture. The emperor disappears, government disappears, and Germany falls into a political vacuum. The evidence is messier. There were kings and rival claimants, including Richard of Cornwall and Alfonso of Castile. What was missing was a ruler able to establish broad, effective authority across the German lands. That distinction matters because the rest of the political system did not stop functioning. For territorial princes, weak central monarchy created room to grow. They expanded courts, strengthened jurisdictions, collected tolls, fortified towns, arranged marriages, and turned old offices into more durable territorial power. Cities were changing too. Along the Rhine, commercial and episcopal centres prospered. Southern German towns linked routes across the Alps with northern markets. In the north, merchant networks developed into what became associated with the Hanseatic League. Some towns remained under bishops or princes. Others gained the status of free or imperial cities and answered, at least formally, directly to the emperor. That meant a city could become a political actor in its own right. Now, zoom in on the map. A bishopric might sit beside a duchy. An imperial city might be surrounded by territory, controlled by another ruler. An abbey could hold territorial rights. A noble family might own scattered lands separated by jurisdictions, belonging to someone else. From a modern perspective, the map looks inefficient, almost by design. But medieval participants did not begin with a blank map and ask how to create the cleanest borders. They inherited rights. Land came through marriage. Privileges were purchased or granted. Wars changed possession. Courts confirmed claims. Monasteries accumulated property. Customs hardened into law. The political map was layered history made visible. Every generation inherited the compromises of the one before it. In 1273, the princes elected Rudolf of Habsburg as king. The choice opened a new phase, but not because Rudolf already controlled overwhelming power. In fact, that was part of his attraction. The princes wanted a king strong enough to restore order, but not so strong that he could reduce them to obedience. Rudolf understood the bargain. He showed less interest in reviving the grand Italian ambitions of the Hohenstaufens, and more interest in strengthening his own dynasty inside Central Europe. His main rival was Otto II, King of Bohemia, whose territories included Austria and Styria. Their struggle ended at the battle on the Marchfeld in 1278. Ottokar was defeated and killed. The Habsburgs then secured Austria and neighbouring lands as the foundation of their dynastic power. That territorial shift would shape the rest of imperial history. The Habsburgs would eventually hold the imperial crown for centuries. But the source of their practical strength was not some enormous imperial treasury. It was their own hereditary lands. This is one of the most useful distinctions in the entire story. An emperor had two political identities. He was head of the empire, and he was also a territorial ruler with lands of his own. When a Habsburg emperor had Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, or other possessions behind him, he could be formidable. Another emperor might carry the same title, while possessing far fewer independent resources. The crown gave rank. It did not automatically provide money, soldiers, or administration. After Rudolf died in 1291, the princes did not simply elect his son, they chose Adolf of Nassau. After further conflict, Albert of Habsburg became king. The message was difficult to miss. No dynasty could safely assume that one successful election had turned the crown into hereditary property. During the 14th century, Habsburgs, Luxembourgs, and Wittelsbachs competed intensely for imperial influence. Their rivalry could destabilize the monarchy. It also forced the empire toward a clearer question. Everyone already knew that princes played a role in choosing the king, but which princes? How exactly should the election work? And how could the empire avoid turning every disputed succession into another civil war? The answer came in 1356. It did not centralize the empire. It did something more characteristic. It wrote the rules of disagreement more clearly. By the 14th century, the empire no longer looked much like the political world of Otto. The emperor still carried Roman prestige. The idea of a wider Christian imperial mission still mattered. Italy had not disappeared from imperial imagination. But north of the Alps, political power was now openly shared with strong territorial princes. The Luxembourg dynasty became especially important in this period, above all under Charles IV. Charles was king of Bohemia, king of the Romans, and eventually emperor. His political centre was Prague, and under his rule the city flourished. In 1348, he founded the university now known as Charles University, one of the earliest universities north of the Alps and east of Paris. Charles has sometimes been criticised for caring more about Bohemia and his family lands than about some later idea of German national unity. That criticism tells us more about later nationalism than about 14th century kingship. An emperor needed a territorial base. Charles understood that if he wanted influence in the empire, he first needed dependable resources, somewhere he could actually govern. His most lasting imperial achievement was not a conquest. It was a document. The Golden Bull of 1356 regulated the election of the King of the Romans, the ruler expected to become emperor. 7 electors received a defined role. 3 were archbishops, Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. 4 were secular rulers, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. The document did not invent election. That tradition was much older. What it did was make election harder to dispute. A majority could decide. The electors received special protections. Their status as the senior princes of the imperial order became clearer, and the Golden Bull said strikingly little about papal approval of the election. That silence is evidence of a long-term change. The German political community was becoming more capable of defining kingship through its own procedures, rather than leaving the process open to a renewed argument over papal confirmation for the Pope. That narrowed an old field of influence. For the electors, it formalized power they already exercised. For the emperor, it reduced the risk that every election would produce multiple kings and years of war. Think of the Golden Bull as less a declaration of central authority than a rulebook for controlled competition. The centre accepted limits in exchange for predictability. That sounds like weakness, if the only measure of strength is how much one ruler can command. But there is another measure: how well a system survives disputed interests without breaking apart. By that measure, the Golden Bull mattered enormously. The later medieval empire was becoming less a monarchy, failing to centralize and more a legal hierarchy of different political communities. That did not make it peaceful. Nobles still fought feuds. Territorial disputes could last generations. Towns struggled with bishops and princes. Families fought over inheritance. Merchant leagues defended roots and privileges. But more and more, those conflicts took place inside a shared language of rights. A charter mattered, a privilege mattered, a court judgment mattered, custom mattered, imperial confirmation mattered. A small lord could not necessarily defeat a great prince in battle, but legal status could give him another way to resist absorption. That is why the empire cannot be judged only by the size of imperial armies. Its institutions were often most useful precisely to people who could not win by force. Then the 14th century brought a disaster no constitution could contain. The Black Death reached Central Europe in the late 1340s. Mortality was immense, economies were disrupted, communities were traumatized. Fear produced violence, as well as grief. Jewish communities were especially vulnerable. False accusations and conspiracy stories spread, and persecution followed in many places. This is an important check on any romantic view of imperial legal diversity. Multiple jurisdictions could protect local rights, but they could also produce very different levels of protection. A minority might be defended in one territory and abandoned in another. The empire had many governments. That was a source of flexibility and sometimes a source of danger. Charles IV died in 1378. That same year, the Western Church entered another crisis. Rival popes claimed authority over Latin Christendom. For a society built around the idea of one universal church, competing popes created more than embarrassment. They created a crisis of legitimacy. Kings chose sides. Princes chose sides. Universities debated how the division could end. Churchmen began asking whether a general council might possess enough authority to resolve a conflict the papacy itself could not settle. Eventually, Emperor Sigismund became deeply involved in that effort. The council that followed would end the schism. It would also help set Bohemia on fire. Sigismund of Luxembourg ruled in a moment when several crises overlapped. The Ottoman Turks were advancing in southeastern Europe. The Western Church remained divided. Bohemia was increasingly tense, and the imperial monarchy still depended on cooperation from territorial rulers who had spent centuries strengthening their own authority. The Great Council of Constance met from 1414 to 1418. Its institutional achievement was enormous. It helped end the Western Schism and restored a single generally recognized pope. But if we follow only that success, we miss the crisis forming inside the same council. A Bohemian religious reformer named Jan Hus had criticized abuses within the church. His thought was influenced in part by the English theologian John Wycliffe, and his preaching attracted strong support in Bohemia. Hus travelled to Constance under a promise of safe conduct associated with Sigismund. Church authorities condemned him for heresy. He was executed in 1415. To many of his supporters, the event was not simply the punishment of one theologian. It became evidence that religious reform, Bohemian grievances, and outside authority were now tied together. The reaction widened into something much larger than a doctrinal dispute. The Hussite movement contained different factions. They did not all want the same political or religious settlement, but together they proved capable of resisting repeated crusading expeditions sent against Bohemia. The Hussite wars of the 1420s and early 1430s exposed a fact that the empire would face again during the Reformation. Religious uniformity could not always be restored by force. Bohemian forces made effective use of war wagons and firearms, frustrating armies drawn from powerful aristocratic coalitions. Repeated campaigns failed to produce the desired settlement. Negotiation eventually did more than crusade after crusade had achieved. That pattern matters because the Hussite crisis was an early warning. A dispute about doctrine could become a dispute about local privilege. A dispute about privilege could become a struggle over royal authority. And once those issues fused, military victory alone might not separate them again. Sigismund died in 1437 without a surviving son. His son-in-law Albert II of Habsburg followed him as king. Albert's reign was brief, but the transition helped restore the Habsburg family to the centre of imperial politics. From the middle of the 15th century onward, with one important 18th century interruption, the imperial crown remained closely associated with the Habsburgs until the empire ended. That did not make the crown legally hereditary. Elections continued. What changed was the territorial weight behind Habsburg candidates. The family became famous for dynastic marriage. Through a series of unions, Habsburg claims would eventually connect Austria to Burgundy, the Netherlands, Spain, Bohemia, Hungary, and territories far outside the empire. But before that dynastic network reached its full scale, the empire itself underwent a quieter transformation. By the late 15th century, complaints about disorder were persistent. Private feuding disrupted trade and security. Justice was uneven. Princes wanted more predictable rules without surrendering their autonomy. The emperor wanted help maintaining public peace and meeting common threats. At the Diet of Worms in 1495, under Maximilian I, a series of measures associated with imperial reform tried to address those problems. Unknown was the eternal public peace, intended to suppress private warfare. Another was the imperial chamber court, the Reichskammergericht, which became one of the empire's highest courts. Its procedures could be slow. Some cases lasted for years, but speed was not the only thing that mattered. The court gave imperial estates and subjects a place to take disputes other than the battlefield. A prince could still be stronger than a count. A city could still be weaker than a duke, yet the legal system created a framework in which status and procedure could sometimes restrain raw power. The empire was building institutions partly because the emperor could not personally enforce every decision. Further reforms created regional administrative groupings, known as imperial circles. From 1500 onward, they helped coordinate matters such as defense, taxation, coinage, and the enforcement of imperial decisions. Again, notice what did not happen. The princes were not abolished, the circles organized them. By around 1500, the empire was not simply a medieval monarchy in slow decline, it was becoming a different kind of political system. The emperor stood at the top, the electors chose the king, the imperial diet represented different estates. High courts interpreted law, imperial circles coordinated regional tasks. Territorial rulers governed their own lands. Authority was distributed because the constitution had grown around distributed power. Then, a new technology changed the speed at which disagreement could travel. Printing presses could reproduce arguments in numbers earlier. Generations had never known. Humanist scholars returned to old texts with new methods. Criticism of church institutions circulated more widely. In 1517, an Augustinian friar teaching in Saxony entered a dispute over indulgences. His name was Martin Luther. The empire had learned how to negotiate princes, cities, bishops, and dynasties. It was about to discover what happened when ideas themselves became impossible to contain. Martin Luther's challenge began inside the late medieval church, not outside it. In 1517, he circulated arguments that became famous as the 95 Theses, aimed especially at the preaching and theology surrounding indulgences. If this had happened 2 centuries earlier, the dispute might have remained among theologians, bishops, and universities for much longer. But now there was print. That changed the rhythm of the crisis. A page copied by hand moves slowly. A printed pamphlet can move from workshop to market, from university town to court, from one city to another. Luther's writings spread far beyond the audience of the original academic dispute, and the political structure of the empire made suppression difficult. There was no single royal bureaucracy able to search every town, close every press, or arrest every preacher. Jurisdiction was fragmented. A university could protect a scholar, A prince could delay enforcement. A city council could decide how aggressively it wanted to pursue dissent. The same decentralization that often frustrated emperors now gave religious controversy room to survive. At almost the same moment, the empire acquired a ruler whose titles suggested almost limitless power. In 1519, the electors chose Charles of Habsburg as King of the Romans. He became Charles V. Charles inherited an astonishing collection of territories. Habsburg lands in Central Europe, Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and expanding possessions overseas. On a map, it looked immense. In government, it was much less simple. Each territory had its own laws, privileges, representative institutions, and political expectations. Charles did not rule one centralized superstate. He ruled a composite monarchy held together by dynasty. The Holy Roman Empire was one part of that larger inheritance, and arguably the hardest part to command directly. In 1521, Luther appeared before the Diet of Worms. He was required to recant writings judged heretical. He refused to give the general retraction demanded of him. The Edict of Worms declared him an outlaw. If imperial authority had worked like a modern centralized state, that might have ended the story. It did not. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, protected Luther. At Wartburg Castle, Luther worked on a German translation of the New Testament. It was not the first German Bible, but its language and circulation gave it enormous influence. Meanwhile, reform spread in forms Luther himself did not control. Some territories adopted Lutheran teaching. Other reformers moved in different theological directions. City councils changed worship. Monasteries were dissolved in some places. Church property changed hands. Clergy married. Schools were reorganized. The religious landscape was changing faster than either emperor or pope could reverse it. Then social unrest brought another complication. The German Peasants' War of 1524 and 1525 drew together complaints about rents, obligations, local rights, lordship, and religion. Some rebels used the language of Christian freedom, but that did not make the uprising simply a Lutheran revolution. Luther himself rejected the revolt and eventually condemned it harshly. Princely armies crushed the uprisings with great violence. The episode destroyed one easy interpretation of the Reformation. There was no single camp of reform united against a single old order. Princes, peasants, urban elites, knights, and theologians could all criticize existing institutions while wanting completely different outcomes. Charles V had little time to solve that problem because he was fighting problems everywhere else. He faced Francis I of France in repeated wars. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman, the Magnificent, pressed into Hungary and threatened Habsburg lands. In 1526, King Louis II of Hungary died after the Battle of Mossy Ses. The Habsburgs acquired claims to Bohemia and Hungary, while much of Hungary became contested among Habsburg, Ottoman, and Transylvanian powers. Vienna itself faced an Ottoman siege in 1529. Now, the contradiction inside Charles's religious policy became obvious. He wanted Protestant resistance brought under control. He also needed German princes to provide troops and money against France and the Ottomans. Some of those princes were Protestant. Religious condemnation and military dependence now existed side by side. Politics kept delaying a final settlement. In 1530, the Diet of Augsburg received the Augsburg Confession, a major statement of Lutheran belief. Compromise failed. Protestant princes and cities later organized the Schmalkaldic League for mutual defense. Charles still hoped for reconciliation or church reform, but the confessional divide became more institutionalized with every passing year. By the 1540s, he was ready to use force. In 1547, Charles defeated the Schmalkaldic League at Mentelberg. The victory looked decisive. Organized Protestant military resistance appeared broken, but battlefield victory and political settlement were not the same thing. Lutheran belief did not disappear, because an army lost. Territorial rulers did not forget their interests. Charles tried to impose an interim religious arrangement, but it satisfied few people. Then alliances shifted in a way that reveals how complicated the conflict had become. Some Protestant princes turned against the emperor. Henry II of France, a Catholic king, intervened against Habsburg power. Confession mattered, so did strategy. Charles was forced to retreat from the idea of a complete settlement on his terms. The compromise came in 1555, negotiated largely by his brother Ferdinand. The Peace of Augsburg gave Lutheranism legal standing alongside Catholicism within the empire. Territorial rulers received the right, within important limits, to determine the official confession of their territories. Subjects unable to accept that confession could in some circumstances emigrate. The settlement is often summarized by the later phrase cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, useful but incomplete. Imperial cities could contain mixed confessional communities. Ecclesiastical territories raised special questions. Individual freedom of religion did not become a universal right. Calvinism, increasingly influential elsewhere, was not included at all. Still, Augsburg marked a profound change. The empire had failed to restore religious unity. Instead of pretending unity still existed, the law was altered so that limited division could be managed. That was a very imperial solution, not one side disappearing, but a new rule for living with disagreement. Charles V disliked the outcome. During the 1550s, he gradually transferred his responsibilities. His brother Ferdinand took control of the Austrian Habsburg lands and succeeded him as emperor. His son Philip II inherited Spain, the Netherlands, and other possessions. The huge Habsburg inheritance split into Austrian and Spanish branches. Charles retired and died in 1558. His larger dream, a strong Habsburg monarchy defending a unified Catholic Christendom, had failed. But the empire had not failed with it. For several decades, Catholics and Lutherans continued inside the same constitutional order. Courts worked. Diets met. Princes bargained. Confessional institutions became more organized. That period of coexistence can make Augsburg look more successful than it really was. The peace had left questions sitting beneath the surface. What if a ruler changed confession? What happened to church lands that became Protestant after the legal cut-off? Where did Calvinists fit? And what happened when a legal dispute over religion also became a dispute over how much authority the emperor should possess? For decades, those questions remained manageable. By the early 17th century, they were beginning to stack on top of one another. The Peace of Augsburg did not make the 30 Years' War inevitable. That is worth emphasizing because later history can make catastrophe look prearranged. For years after 1555, Catholic and Lutheran territories traded, negotiated, married into one another's dynasties, and participated in imperial institutions. Calvinist territories joined that landscape too, even though their legal position under Augsburg was unresolved. Everyday coexistence continued, but underneath it, confessional boundaries hardened. Rulers built schools and church administrations designed to shape subjects into Catholics, Lutherans, or Calvinists. Religious identity became more organized, more territorial, and more closely tied to political authority. Inside one territory, that could create stability. Across the empire, it could make suspicion sharper. A dispute over church property now carried a confessional label. A court ruling could be interpreted as Catholic or Protestant bias. A political appointment could look like part of a religious strategy. The same legal mechanisms that had once contained disputes were now being judged through competing confessional lenses. Trust weakened. By the early 17th century, rival defensive alliances appeared. The Protestant Union formed in 1608. The Catholic League followed in 1609. Neither alliance included every territory of its confession. Neither made general war unavoidable. But both were signs that more rulers were preparing for the possibility that law might fail. The immediate crisis came from Bohemia. Bohemia belonged to the Habsburg dynastic complex, but it had its own estates, privileges, and constitutional traditions. Its religious landscape was unusually diverse. When the Catholic Habsburg Ferdinand of Styria seemed likely to pursue a more assertive religious policy, Protestant nobles feared that their existing rights were in danger. In May 1618, several of those nobles confronted royal officials in Prague Castle. 2 governors and a secretary were thrown from a window. They survived. The defenestration of Prague became the symbolic opening of a much larger crisis. At first, this was a rebellion inside Bohemia. The Bohemian estates rejected Ferdinand and offered their crown to Frederick V, the Calvinist, Elector Palatine, but Ferdinand became Holy Roman Emperor as Ferdinand II. Now a Bohemian revolt was tied directly to the electoral politics of the empire. In 1620, Catholic and imperial forces defeated the Bohemian army at White Mountain outside Prague. Frederick's rule in Bohemia collapsed. If the war had been only about the Bohemian crown, that might have ended it. Instead, victory widened the problem. The Palatinate became a battlefield. Spain supported the Austrian Habsburgs and had strategic interests in routes linking its European possessions. Protestant rulers worried about Habsburg power. Denmark intervened. Then Sweden entered the war under Gustavus Adolphus. Eventually France entered more openly as well, even though France was a Catholic monarchy. That fact breaks another overly simple explanation. The 30 Years' War was deeply shaped by religion, but it did not remain a straightforward war of Catholics against Protestants. Dynastic security mattered. Strategic corridors mattered. Territorial control mattered. The European balance of power mattered. For people living in the path of armies, those distinctions often mattered much less than the next demand for food or money. A field army could not be supplied indefinitely from a distant capital. Soldiers needed grain, horses, shelter, cash, and equipment from the regions around them. Imagine the war through a town account book rather than a battle painting. One army arrives and demands contributions. The town pays. Months later, another force appears and demands payment again. Trade slows. Harvest work is disrupted. Livestock disappears. Disease follows military movement and displacement. Some regions suffered catastrophic population loss, though the scale varied sharply from place to place, and precise numbers remain debated. The war was not one uninterrupted front stretching across 30 years. There were campaigns, pauses, negotiations, shifting alliances, and wide differences between regions. One area might experience relative calm, while another was repeatedly occupied. That unevenness is important because it shows both sides of imperial fragmentation. Fragmentation made coordinated defense difficult, but local governments could sometimes negotiate contributions, preserve records, organize rebuilding, or maintain a degree of continuity when central authority was weak. The empire was part of the problem, and part of the machinery people used to survive the problem. In 1631, Swedish and Allied forces won a major victory at Breitenfeld. Gustavus Adolphus demonstrated the power of a well-organized field army. He was killed at Litzen the following year. Sweden remained in the war. Another figure, Albrecht von Wallenstein, showed how warfare itself was changing imperial politics. Wallenstein could raise and sustain enormous forces, which made him invaluable to Ferdinand II. It also made him dangerous. A commander with his own networks, army, and negotiations could begin to look like an independent political power. Wallenstein's contacts and growing influence alarmed the emperor. After he was removed from command, he was assassinated in 1634. That same year, imperial and Spanish forces defeated the Swedes at Adlingen. Once again, a major victory failed to end the war. In 1635, the Peace of Prague reconciled Ferdinand II with several German Protestant estates. If the conflict had remained mostly an internal imperial war, that settlement might have brought peace much closer. But France now intervened more openly against the Habsburgs. The war had become part of a broader Bourbon-Habsburg struggle across Europe. By the 1640s, exhaustion was everywhere. No side could realistically impose a complete settlement by force. Diplomats gathered in Munster and Osnabrück in Westphalia. Negotiation continued while armies remained in the field. The process was slow because the war had accumulated too many questions. The emperor had to negotiate with foreign monarchies. Imperial estates defended their constitutional rights. Confessional arrangements had to be rewritten. Territorial claims overlapped. Even ceremonial precedents mattered, because where an ambassador sat, how he was addressed, and whose title was recognized could imply legal rank. The peace took years to construct. In 1648, the agreements collectively known as the Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War within the empire and settled major parts of the wider European conflict. The empire that came out of Westphalia was clearly decentralized. The stronger question is whether that meant it had become irrelevant. For a long time, the standard answer was yes. The institutions that survived tell a different story. A familiar version of imperial history treats 1648 as the moment the Holy Roman Empire became an empty shell. The evidence does support one part of that argument. Westphalia confirmed the strength of the imperial estates. Princes kept extensive rights in territorial government and diplomacy. The emperor could not turn the empire into a centralized Habsburg monarchy. Sweden received territories and influence within the imperial system. France made major gains. The Dutch Republic and Swiss Confederation stood outside the empire's effective constitutional order. Calvinists gained legal recognition alongside Catholics and Lutherans. But if the empire had become meaningless, we would expect its institutions to wither. They did not. Westphalia did not abolish the Reich. It clarified and reconstructed the rules under which its members operated. The estates had wide diplomatic freedom, but their alliances were not supposed to be directed against the emperor or the empire. Imperial law continued. The imperial chamber court continued. The Aulic Council in Vienna remained another high judicial body. The imperial diet continued to coordinate common political business. After 1663, the diet at Regensburg became effectively permanent, with representatives conducting routine work on behalf of rulers who were usually elsewhere. This was not a national parliament. It was not a centralized royal council. It was something more peculiar, a permanent political forum inside a constitutional system made up of unequal territories with overlapping rights. Slow, certainly. But slow did not mean useless. Consider the position of a small imperial city or a minor count surrounded by stronger neighbors. A powerful prince might prefer to absorb that territory. The weaker party might prefer an imperial court, where legal status could matter more than military size. Ecclesiastical territories benefited from the same structure. Prince, bishoprics and abbeys survived inside the empire, long after more centralized states might have absorbed them. To inhabitants of such places, the empire was not an abstract medieval memory. It was the legal framework that helped their political community continue to exist. The emperor still mattered, especially when the emperor also ruled substantial, hereditary lands. After the 30 Years' War, the Austrian Habsburgs focused increasingly on strengthening their own monarchy. That monarchy faced a major external threat from the Ottoman Empire. In 1683, an Ottoman army besieged Vienna. The city was relieved by a broad coalition that included the forces of the Polish, Lithuanian King John III Sobieski, as well as Habsburg and other imperial troops. The victory did not recreate medieval imperial unity. It did show that common military action remained possible when interests aligned. In the wars that followed, Ottoman power was pushed back from much of Hungary, and the Habsburg monarchy became one of Europe's great powers. But again, the source of that strength is easy to misunderstand. The Habsburgs were strong mainly because of Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and their other dynastic lands. They did not command all imperial territories as provinces. The distinction becomes even clearer when we look north to Brandenburg. Prussia, the Hohenzollern rulers of Brandenburg were electors inside the empire. They also controlled Prussia, which stood partly outside the empire's constitutional boundaries. In 1701, Elector Frederick III crowned himself king in Prussia. The wording was careful. Inside the empire, he remained Elector of Brandenburg and an imperial prince. In Prussia, he could claim royal status. One dynasty was now operating under different legal identities at the same time. That may sound strange today, but it was normal in early modern Europe. Rulers collected territories with different laws, rather than merging everything into one uniform state. During the 18th century, Prussia grew stronger. Its army expanded. Its government became increasingly effective at extracting military resources from scattered lands. Under Frederick II, Frederick the Great, Prussia challenged Austria directly. In 1740, Frederick invaded Silesia, a wealthy Habsburg province. At almost the same moment, the death of Emperor Charles VI triggered a wider dynastic crisis. His daughter Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg hereditary lands under the arrangements her father had defended for years, but rival powers challenged her position. In 1742, Charles Albert of Bavaria was elected emperor as Charles VII. For the first time in centuries, the imperial crown passed to a non-Habsburg. His reign was brief. He died in 1745, and Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, was elected Francis I. The episode showed both sides of the imperial system. The crown was genuinely elective, but Habsburg territorial power still made the dynasty extraordinarily difficult to dislodge for long. Maria Theresa was never wholly Roman Empress regnant, yet she remained the dominant political figure in the Habsburg monarchy. The rivalry between Austria and Prussia now shaped German politics more than the old medieval struggle between emperor and pope ever had. During the 7 Years' War, beginning in 1756, that rivalry became part of a much wider conflict involving Britain, France, Russia, and other powers. Imperial estates took different positions. The Reich could not prevent its largest members from acting like great powers. And yet, beneath those wars, imperial courts continued hearing cases. The Diet continued. Territorial rulers still defended privileges, because those privileges were defined within imperial law. This is why the language of simple decline misses so much. The empire could be weak as a military command structure and useful as a legal order at the same time. By the later 18th century, however, the surrounding political world was changing quickly. Enlightenment thinkers debated natural rights, toleration, sovereignty, and rational government. Reforming monarchs tried to standardize administration. Corporate privileges that had once looked like protections increasingly looked inefficient to rulers who wanted uniform taxes and centralized control. Within the Habsburg monarchy, Joseph II pushed ambitious reforms after becoming sole ruler of the hereditary lands in 1780. He expanded religious toleration, challenged some ecclesiastical institutions, and tried to make administration more uniform. Resistance followed because local communities and estates defended inherited rights. The old imperial tension was still there. Efficiency at the centre versus privilege in the territories. Then, in 1789, revolution began in France. The Holy Roman Empire had survived dynastic collapse, religious division, princely rivalry, and 30 years of war. What it had not yet faced was a political power willing to redraw the map itself. The French Revolution began as a crisis of the French monarchy, not as a plan to destroy the Holy Roman Empire. But revolutions do not stay neatly inside borders when neighbouring rulers fear them, and revolutionaries fear neighbouring rulers in return. Migrant nobles gathered outside France. European monarchies watched events in Paris with growing alarm. Revolutionary leaders became increasingly suspicious of foreign intervention. In 1792, France went to war with Austria. That same year, Francis II became Holy Roman Emperor. He would be the last. The wars that followed were different from most conflicts the empire had survived before. An 18th century ruler might seize a province, gain a fortress, or force a dynastic concession. Revolutionary France could arrive with a different political program entirely. Old privileges might be abolished. Ecclesiastical property could be secularized. Feudal rights could be removed. Administrative borders could be redrawn. The issue was no longer only who ruled a territory. It was whether the territory would continue to exist in the same constitutional form. The western parts of the empire were especially exposed. French armies occupied lands west of the Rhine. The Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797, followed by further negotiations, made clear that German rulers who lost territory, they would demand compensation somewhere else. That immediately created a second problem. Compensation had to come from somebody. By the opening years of the 19th century, the answer was increasingly obvious. Smaller territories, especially ecclesiastical states and free imperial cities, would pay the price. In 1803, the Great Territorial Reorganization, known as the Reichsdeputationsschluss, transformed the imperial map. Most ecclesiastical principalities were secularized. Many free imperial cities lost their independence. Larger states absorbed smaller ones. Now compare the map with the one we saw during the Great Interregnum. For centuries, the empire had accumulated political layers. Bishoprics beside duchies, abbeys beside counties, cities protected by imperial status, scattered jurisdictions held together by old privileges. In a few years, much of that layered landscape was stripped away. The empire still existed on paper, but many of the small political communities that had depended most heavily on imperial courts and imperial protection were disappearing. That weakened the old system in a way military defeat alone never had. Napoleon Bonaparte accelerated the process. He had risen from revolutionary general to first consul, and then, in 1804, Emperor of the French. His power reorganized European politics around French military dominance and a network of allied states. Francis II could see what was happening. In 1804, he adopted a second imperial title and became Francis I, Emperor of Austria, while remaining Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor. For a brief period, one man held two imperial titles. That was not just ceremony, it was insurance. If the old Reich disappeared, the Habsburg dynasty would still possess an imperial dignity tied to its hereditary lands. The decisive military blow came in 1805. Austria joined another coalition against Napoleon. The campaign ended disastrously at Austerlitz, where French forces defeated the combined Austrian and Russian armies. The Peace of Pressburg weakened Austrian influence in Germany and rewarded Napoleon's allies. Bavaria and Württemberg became kingdoms. Other states gained new territory and status. The hierarchy of the empire was being rewritten, but no longer mainly by imperial diets, electors, courts, or negotiated internal reform. It was being rewritten under French pressure. Then came the Confederation of the Rhine. In July 1806, 16 German princes joined the new confederation under Napoleon's protection and withdrew from the Holy Roman Empire. At that point, the problem was no longer theoretical. An emperor cannot preside over a political body if major members openly leave and place themselves under another emperor's protection. The constitutional structure had lost too much of its substance. On the 6th of August, 1806, Francis issued a declaration giving up the imperial crown and releasing the imperial estates from their obligations to the empire. There was no final siege of an imperial capital. No last emperor died defending a palace. No single battle marked the exact second when 1,000 years of political memory ended. The empire ended through a legal act, in a strange way that fitted its history. This had always been a political order built from titles, privileges, elections, obligations, charters, and negotiated rights. When the old obligations could no longer be maintained, the final act was written in the language of law. The crown that had passed through Saxons Salians, Hohenstaufens, Luxembourgs, Wittelsbachs, and Habsburgs disappeared. But before we call that simply a failure, we need to ask what exactly had failed. Because the empire Napoleon dismantled was not a centralized state that had somehow forgotten to centralize. It was something else. The easiest way to misunderstand the Holy Roman Empire is to compare it with the nation states that came later and score it by their rules. By that standard, the list of defects is long. No single national capital, no fixed hereditary succession, no uniform administration, borders that changed, hundreds of political units, overlapping jurisdictions, slow courts, a slow diet, princes who could ignore imperial priorities, an emperor who often depended on the very men he was supposed to lead. From that angle, the empire looks like an unfinished Germany, but that assumes medieval and early modern Europeans were all moving toward a 19th century German nation state and simply failed to arrive on schedule. They were not. The people who lived inside the empire inhabited layers of identity. A person might belong to a town, obey a territorial prince, follow a particular confession, speak a regional dialect, hold rights through an estate or guild, and still live under the wider legal umbrella of the Reich. Those identities did not have to cancel one another out. The imperial system made room for overlap because authority itself was divided. That created obvious problems. It also created protections. Free imperial cities could preserve substantial self-government. Prince, bishoprics and abbeys could survive among secular states. Minor nobles could use imperial status against larger neighbours. Territorial princes could govern their own lands while still participating in common institutions. Religious coexistence, once established after terrible conflict, could also be written into imperial law rather than left to the personal tolerance of one monarch. None of this made the system liberal in a modern sense. Local rulers could still persecute. Courts could still fail. Social hierarchy remained deep. Religious minorities could still be vulnerable. The point is narrower. Because power was divided, no single authority could easily make every local institution disappear at once. The high courts became especially important after the late medieval reforms and Westphalia. Estates and subjects brought disputes before them. Proceedings could be slow, but a slow legal process might still be preferable to facing a stronger prince with no appeal at all. The same political variety shaped culture. There was no single court able to absorb every musician, painter, architect, scholar, or printer. Vienna mattered, but so did Dresden, Munich, Prague, Salzburg, Mannheim, Weimar, and many smaller cities and courts. Political competition created many patrons. Religious diversity developed in a similar way. The Reformation survived in part because territorial rulers could protect reformers. Catholic renewal remained strong elsewhere. Different confessions existed in close proximity, sometimes peacefully, sometimes tensely, but increasingly without any realistic possibility that one ruler could make the entire empire religiously uniform again. That forced negotiation. The emperor's weakness also needs to be handled carefully. Some emperors were extremely powerful. Otto I dominated the politics of his age. Henry III exercised extraordinary influence over the church. Barbarossa mobilized major military resources. Charles V ruled a dynastic inheritance spread across Europe and beyond. Later Habsburgs became great power monarchs, but their strength never came from the imperial title alone. The title gave prestige, rank, legal authority, and a unique place in the constitution. Practical power still came from land, money, troops, allies, and political skill. That separation between office and resources was one reason the empire resisted absolute monarchy. It was also one reason the empire could survive a weak emperor. If the ruler in Vienna or Prague lacked resources, local courts still sat, city councils still met, princes still governed, imperial circles still coordinated, estates still defended rights. The system did not depend on one administrative machine, so one failure could not easily shut the whole machine down. This gives us a better answer to the question from the beginning of the story. Why did such a divided empire last so long? Partly because division was not simply damage done to the system. Over time, division became organized. A dynasty could end, and the office could continue. A religious settlement could fail, and a new legal compromise could replace it. A prince could resist the emperor without necessarily wanting the empire abolished. A city could defend its autonomy by appealing to the same imperial constitution that limited imperial power. The arrangement was untidy because it was designed less often than it was accumulated. Each crisis added another repair. Each repair added another layer. By 1800, the layers had become difficult to reconcile with the military and administrative power of revolutionary France. The empire could adapt to dynastic rivalry, confessional division, and legal pluralism. It could not adapt quickly enough to a power that was removing the small states, secularizing the church territories, and redrawing the map on which the old balances depended. Napoleon did not destroy a 1,000-year-old centralized nation-state. He dismantled a constitutional environment whose survival depended on the continued existence of many different kinds of political community. And even after 1806, the deeper problem remained. How could the many peoples and states of Central Europe belong to something larger without all becoming the same thing? The 19th century would answer that question very differently. The end of the Holy Roman Empire did not make Central Europe simple. Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine replaced part of the old structure, but it depended on French power. When Napoleon's empire collapsed, Europe's rulers met at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815 to build another order. They did not restore the Holy Roman Empire. Too much of its old social and territorial foundation had already been dismantled. Instead, dozens of German states entered the German Confederation, with Austria holding the leading position. The old rivalry between Austria and Prussia remained. But the political question was changing. Medieval emperors had claimed a Roman and Christian dignity larger than any one people. 19th century nationalists increasingly asked a different question. Should people who understood themselves as Germans have a unified German nation-state? Those two ideas were not the same. The Holy Roman Empire had included Czechs, Italians, Slovenes, French-speaking communities, Dutch-speaking populations, and many others at different moments. Its borders never matched one language or one modern nationality. Nationalism looked for a different source of political legitimacy. The revolutions of 1848 tried, among many other goals, to create a constitutional form of German unity. They failed to settle the issue. Then Prussia, under King Wilhelm I and the political leadership of Otto von Bismarck, achieved unification through war and diplomacy. Austria was excluded from the new German state. In 1871, a German empire was proclaimed. Its ruler was also called Kaiser, but this was not the Holy Roman Empire returning under another name. The political principles were different. The new empire was a national federation dominated by Prussia, not a universal Christian monarchy claiming continuity with Rome. The old Reich belonged to another political world. And yet that world never became completely invisible. Travel through Central Europe and its old geography still appears in fragments. A cathedral may stand in a city once ruled by a prince, bishop. A town hall may belong to a former free imperial city. A castle may overlook land that was once a separate principality. Universities founded by rival rulers still operate. Regional traditions can preserve the memory of political borders that disappeared generations ago. The imperial regalia survived too. Crowns, robes, weapons, and ceremonial objects that once carried claims about sacred kingship became museum pieces. Removed from coronations and court ritual, they now look silent, but the silence can be misleading. Those objects once belonged to a political imagination in which the emperor was not simply a national monarch. He stood at the top of a layered Christian order, even though the people beneath him spent centuries debating what that position actually allowed him to do. That is why simple verdicts on the Holy Roman Empire are rarely satisfying. Calling it a ridiculous failure ignores the fact that it lasted for centuries and provided real legal and political structures to the people inside it. Calling it a lost golden age of European unity ignores the wars, persecution, coercion, inequality, and repeated constitutional crises. It was neither joke nor utopia. It was a political order built for a world very different from ours. Its emperors inherited the memory of Rome. Its princes defended territorial rights. Its bishops combined spiritual and secular authority. Its cities traded under charters and guarded local privileges. Its courts tried to turn disputes into cases. Its diets tried to turn rivalry into negotiation. Again and again, the same tension returned. Unity mattered. Autonomy mattered too. An emperor tried to strengthen the centre, and princes asked what rights would be lost. A pope challenged an emperor, and the emperor challenged the pope in return. Cities resisted imperial control, then appealed to imperial law when threatened by someone closer to home. Catholics and Protestants fought one of Europe's most destructive wars, then remained inside the same constitutional system. Austria and Prussia competed for mastery, while both still belonged to the Reich. The empire did not solve those contradictions. It learned to contain them for long periods. That distinction may be the most important one. Modern political language often asks where sovereignty is located, as though there must be one final answer. Inside the Holy Roman Empire, the answer depended on the issue. The emperor had some rights, electors had others, territorial princes had others, cities had privileges, estates had claims. Courts could interpret boundaries between them. Authority was divided because society itself was organized through overlapping rights. Sometimes that made government painfully slow. Sometimes it allowed injustice to hide behind privilege. But sometimes the inability of any one ruler to dominate everyone else gave smaller communities room to survive. The empire produced devastating conflict and later built legal mechanisms to restrain conflict. It broke religious unity and then constructed a framework in which several major confessions could coexist. It repeatedly failed to centralize and repeatedly survived the dynasties that tried to centralize it. Its political heart lay mostly north of the Alps, yet its highest title always looked back toward Rome. That contradiction never disappeared. Neither did the empire until the political balance beneath it disappeared. First, by 1806, larger states had absorbed many smaller ones. Most ecclesiastical principalities were gone. Revolutionary and Napoleonic warfare had altered the rules of power. Francis already possessed an Austrian imperial title. German princes who once needed the Reich increasingly looked to new alliances and new states for protection. On the 6th of August, the old constitutional bonds were released. There would be no next imperial election. No king of the Romans would wait for a coronation. No future emperor would inherit the old task of balancing princes, bishops, cities, popes, estates, and dynastic territories under one Roman title. The office ended. The questions did not. How much authority should sit at the centre? How much should remain local? How can communities with different laws, identities, and beliefs share a political structure without one erasing the others? How long can an imperfect system survive when enough people still find it safer than the alternatives? The Holy Roman Empire answered those questions in one particular way. It did not demand complete uniformity. It negotiated. It layered one compromise on another. When dynasties ended, offices continued. When religious unity failed, law adjusted. When emperors weakened, local institutions kept working. When princes resisted, they often resisted from inside the imperial constitution rather than outside it. For more than 8 centuries after Otto's coronation, and for more than 1,000 years if we follow the Western imperial idea back to Charlemagne, the crown passed from one generation to another while the institution beneath it changed. At first, it evoked the revival of Rome in the West. Then it became the prize of German kings. It became the centre of conflict between emperor and pope. It became a negotiated framework for princes and cities. It became a legal home for rival Christian confessions. And finally, it became an early modern federation trying to survive in an age of centralized monarchies and revolutionary armies. The name lasted because the institution kept changing. That adaptability was one of its greatest strengths. Eventually, it reached a limit. Today, the old empire is easiest to find not on one map but in fragments, archives, churches, palaces, city walls, court records, university foundations, local boundaries, and old titles that no longer carry political force. The electors no longer assemble. The imperial courts are gone. No messenger carries an emperor's order from one principality to another under the authority of the Reich. But if we return to the question we began with, the long survival of the empire looks less mysterious now. It lasted because its divisions were gradually turned into rules. The rules were imperfect. They could be slow. They could fail badly. But for centuries, they gave very different political communities reasons to remain inside the same wider order. That is a quieter achievement than conquest. It is also a more durable one. From Lamplight and Historian, thank you for spending this quiet evening with me. I'm Charles. Good night.